least. I don't know if it distracts you.
I think it probably distracts me.
Right. This is Quinn. She's rad. She is a longish time friend of mine now, who I already had a deep respect for her writings and approach in her journalism, simply because she takes a very nuanced but also outraged view, like principled outrage of, is this really what we're doing to ourselves, in a constructive way. And so I've learned a lot from Quinn, especially around networks and how people interact, that is both kind and also expects more of people. And so I was really excited, one, when she was already in town, but two, when she was excited to give a talk. So I'm glad that you all are here. Does everyone want to just say your name and how you're doing today? You want to start?
I'm Matt, and this is my second cup of coffee, so I'd say I'm doing very well right now.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Pam. I'm super glad. Thank you both for making this happen. And Becca, hi, welcome. I'm doing okay. I have a giant octopus kite that I brought here today that I don't know how to string up, so I'll be even better if anybody's willing to help me get out there. And an open call out to many people.
If you're watching on the internet, giant octopus kite.
Not
cat. Sorry. Octopus, giant octopus cat kite would be amazing. Giant octopus kite. Yes.
I'm Robert. I'm trying to wake up. Gabe, very excited to start.
I'm Kendra. I'm reaching the end of spring break, which is unfortunate.
I'm Griffin, and I now have coffee.
Yay!
What's your name?
Coffee is the theme.
I'm Jenny. I also now have coffee.
And for the internet, if anyone is watching, I turned on Q&A on the Hangout, and so we'll look at those at the end.
That sounds good. I'm hoping that if you guys have Twitter, you can tweet this out. I'm not currently online, so I can't retweet it. All right. So this is a new talk. It might be a little rough. We're going to be jumping around a lot of ideas. It's a talk about online activism, business models, and conflict on the internet, and all these other things, in which I'm kind of trying to bring together a lot of themes that I've talked about over the years. And for me, there's always been a thread between these themes, but it hasn't always been obvious to other people what the thread between the themes in my head is, as it turns out. Apparently, none of you can see into my mind. So this is the internet. This is always the picture I love using for the internet. And the internet inverts social norms. It turns conduits into barriers and the other way around. And let's start with a wonderful example of this. Everybody's favorite organization, the RIAA. And here's why I'm going to tell you it should be one of your favorite organizations. Because if you're back in the 1950s, the RIAA, or I want to say it's late 40s, early 50s, RIAA is founded. And it's founded as a standards body to make the distribution of a new technology and the culture that goes along with it something everyone can use. And it's really geeky. Like if you're a really geeky music fan in the 1950s, this is where you go, right? Like the sysadmins and coders of their age would go here. And what they did was amazing because they standardized distribution and the technical standards for record players so that any record could play on any player. And it opened up a world of music that hadn't been available to many communities before. So it meant that the thing that was recently done in New York City could be down in Baton Rouge within a few days. And before that, if you were outside of Baton Rouge with your family, the music you got to hear was just the music of your community. You didn't get access to this other culture. So it was this really interesting and amazing institution. Now, of course, it's not the only one. There's many of these during this age that are standardizing things across society and allowing culture to become a more universal thing. So that's why the RIAA should be something that you really like and appreciate. But of course, something happened, right? Like, when did we first hear about the RIAA? Because the RIAA is a trade association. Why? You don't know anything about like the Siding Manufacturers Trade Association or their conventions, right? Like, it isn't anything that you normally know about if you're not in the business. But now we all know who aren't in the business about the RIAA. And what happened was that every part of the RIAA's mission that was established in the 1950s started being taken over by this global network. Now, we concentrate on distribution when we talk about this, because this is where they really found this, this legal place to clamp down in the Napster case. And that's when we all learned about what the RIAA was the Napster case. But to be honest, the RIAA was getting thrown into chaos before that, because every artist discovery, music production, and distribution, all these different points, even educational pieces, were being taken over by this network. The RIAA never changed what it did, but it stopped being the conduit for music getting out to culture and became the barrier that stopped music from getting out to culture. Now, let's take a moment of silence for the poor people at the RIAA, because they didn't do, okay, moment. All right. Because they didn't do anything wrong to find themselves in this situation. They did what they'd always done. They'd gone the same direction, and the world did a 180 around them. If that happens to anyone, it makes you crazy. And I have called the RIAA as a journalist in a totally neutral context, and the defensiveness and hostility was amazing before I'd even managed, I mean, at one point in the middle of some scandal. And the defensiveness and hostility was amazing, and I hadn't even stated my position. And I was like, I am calling people who are going crazy, but they're going crazy because the world changed and it didn't give them any time to understand or catch up. So for a moment, I want you to imagine what that'd be like. If the thing that you did to make the world better, somebody just started telling you nothing changed about what you did, but now you're making the world worse and we all hate you. That's hard to deal with. Now, let's give you another example that people don't know as well. Maybe people in this room, but usually people don't know this one very well. OCLC was founded in 1967 by a really, really wonderful librarian dude who has realized there's a bunch of data and we all need to share it. And it's a nonprofit. It's there to gather data about all the books that exist in the world and share them. It's librarians sharing information. What could be more kittens and puppies in morality than librarians sharing information? It's the nicest thing in the universe, and it was for a long time. And it grew. They were good at what they did. They gathered together and made this thing called WorldCat, and now they're an organization with over 1,000 employees, gathering, sharing, training people on knowledge. They have sliding scales for libraries, which they've always had because this costs money to do. And that some of those sliding scales go down to less than $1,000 for access to this amazing body of knowledge about all the books. But things changed. In 2008, they changed their policies. And suddenly the moral kitten started looking a lot more like maybe a grown-up predator. What happened? Well, this happened. Other things happened, but this is the one I know a lot about. It's the one I know because it happened to someone that I knew. Someone who had this idea that they could do the same thing that OCLC was doing, but they could do it bigger and better and make it freer, maybe entirely free. Share it with the whole world, which was the stated mission of OCLC, which it was their reason for being, was to create this big body of knowledge and share it with the whole world. Well, OCLC started claiming ownership of their bibliographic data. It asserted copyrights on database, which you can't do in the US. So it began to lie to libraries. It began to force libraries to sign do not compete agreements on their bibliographic data. It started going to war with free information. After starting as a free information organization. Now, why did it do this? Over 1,000 people, they've got mortgages, they've got houses, they've got children that they want to send to good schools. Their OCLC was worth $200 million according to their most recent financial filings, which is not really small. They have revenues of $202 million, and they pay over $131 million in employment costs. OCLC was fighting for their life, and the only way they could be alive was if they started to become a barrier to the very thing they were invented to be a conduit to do. Now, a lot of people in certain communities that know about this story don't see OCLC as a good guy. But there's a relationship between organisms and the communities that they create, in that both of them want to live, even if their reason for living may have at some point vanished. And that's what we've been seeing the network do. This is a story that repeats itself over and over and over again. One of the reasons I like throwing Netflix up there is because they started with one thing, and then they started kind of fighting back against what people saw as their position as their position changed. And it doesn't stop at media. Other things. This one up in the corner is one of my favorite recent stories. Some artists did Duchamp's chess set in 3D and put it on Thingiverse. And Duchamp's estate issued a takedown and got into a legal fight with them. And they went ahead and took it down. And eventually they created another set that was a parody by putting the mustaches Duchamp used on. Of course, the irony of this is that it's Duchamp, right? Like, he put a mustache on the Mona Lisa and called it art. So they put mustaches on his chess pieces and called it parody. And again, this goes to these things that, these inversions that this network age that we're living in goes through. To mention some of Clay Shirky's ideas as well here. The internet, our society is built on a select and publish culture. The internet is a publish and select culture. When I was doing a lot of work with Anonymous, I had to kind of explain to a lot of other journalists and people that when they did this like crazy heavy duty music action movie video about how they were going to take something down, that was that was Anonymous's way of saying to the internet, I'd like to talk about this rather than that it's going to happen. And that was something that a lot of people coming from much more traditional ways of publishing really had a hard time understanding, that this thing that looked very high production value, because production values don't tell you anything anymore. Not the way they used to. They aren't code for the same thing. They weren't code for the same thing with the RIAA or announcements of actions or even movies. They don't tell you what the story is behind it in a way that they did when that stuff used to need big institutions to do. So there's like the social fatics around where we think power is don't make any sense when you're on a network. And get some other ones. And what that helps contribute to is again a Dana Boyd term in this case, context collapse. The fact that you can think you're doing one thing to one audience when in fact all of a sudden that can be somewhere else performing a different action in front of another audience. But we're also, I like to say that the internet is the invisible city. So we've all moved to the invisible city, and none of us know how to cross the road without getting hit by the invisible cars. We don't have any social norms for the network. And that makes sense. Well, the last thing we had to develop social norms for was living in urban landscapes. And we took a few hundred years to develop those social norms. I remember when there wasn't really an internet, and I'm not that old. That's not enough time to develop society-wide social norms. And as a result, we are stumbling. This is absolutely one of my favorite things ever. It's kind of not really getting what was going on. And we don't know how to read the information. We don't know what to trust. We're still kind of coming out of a culture that told us the camera never lies. So we're not really kind of like putting up the right gateways in our head to understand what's coming in. We're also not really putting up the right gateways on what's going out. I regularly, when I'm feeling too happy about the world, I regularly do a Twitter search for kill yourself. And it's all out there. And we're all kind of saying things that we just said in our heads for a long time. we don't understand yet that they're not really staying in our heads. And we just don't know how to behave. And speaking of not knowing how to behave, like, it's pushing us to these hyperbolic levels. And I absolutely love this particular tweet because it's so ridiculous. It's not something that, like, they would have never said, but it's something they would have never said in an absolutely permanent, totally public, continually available medium, which we're having a really hard, so we don't really have the right barriers for what comes out of our mouths or goes into our mouths at this point. And really, like, it just kind of, this is how I think we're all looking at the internet. I think we are all Ice Cube when it comes to the internet. And that one thing about all of that stuff that is also really hard to wrap your head around is that there's a thing I used to regularly call the fourth dimension of privacy, which is ephemerality. So privacy, and there's a whole other talk in this, which I won't do right now, but privacy is this social construct. It's not just a digital construct. It's not just something we use encryption for. It's like the whole point of privacy is that we share private data with certain people, and it's how we create relationships and community. I like to divide secrecy and privacy. Secrecy in modern life is usually strings of numbers. Privacy is when I tell Willow about a bad relationship I had one time. I don't really want to tell the internet about it, but if I tell Willow on the internet, the other thing that's really handy is that Willow is not a digital machine, and she's probably not going to remember at least all the details. She's going to forget at some point. And that's useful for me because it means Willow is going to allow me to change. She's going to be part of my community, but she's also going to allow me to change. Somebody who remembers everything you ever did and is constantly reminding you of it is going to make it really hard for you to step back from your, like, 16-year-old Ayn Rand period. Because you're always stuck having to defend an opinion you don't really need to defend anymore. The internet doesn't want to let people change. Because the way we change is by forgetting how we are and forgetting how other people are. The internet loses things, but it doesn't forget things. It's an important difference. So back when I was interviewing people in the Arab Spring, one Tunisian activist told me with this kind of wonder and fear and frustration that we're living in the post-punk era. He said there's no gods and no masters, no leaders, nothing like we used to have.
Post-punk as a musical style is also goth. Did you know this?
I just learned more about goth. It's like I'm on the internet now. And I think he makes a really good point. And it gets to this other quality, like several of the qualities that this internet has, which is like the publish then select. It also has an inversion of the model of agency. When we're in the regular world at an institution like Harvard, I don't know if I'm doing that right. I'm from California, and we will go through a lot of layers of climbing a hierarchy and learning things and doing a lot of scut work to prove that we've learned the things. And as that goes on, people will give us more responsibility, and we can turn that responsibility into social capital through time. On the internet, not so much. On the internet, you act, and that social capital allows you to act, right? On the internet, you act, and that allows you to build social capital, which you spend for responsibility to act more, and eventually somebody may come along and give you some hierarchical title. It completely inverts that agency change. As I like to say, when I was a teenager, if I wanted to talk to thousands of people, I would not. Maybe I could take a career path that would get me there. As an adult, if I want to potentially talk to close to 20,000 people, I can send them a picture of my lunch. They may or may not care about it, but that's actually kind of true even if you've gone hierarchical route. So for all intents and purposes, for what we seem to have constructed as leadership in the history of humanity in the past 12,000 years, we are living in a time that seems radically and disturbingly devoid of leaders. And I think that's the fate of this century. There haven't been many great leaders. There's no divinely ordained kings. We don't really think of people as divinely ordained anymore. We don't have any blessed caliphs. That used to be the thing that held Islam together. I think that that's maybe one of the reasons Islam is having some trouble right now, is because it was originally a political program as well as a religion. And that political program isn't really working in the media age in the same way. But it's not Islam's fault. Our political programs are working for anyone in this media age. There's no great man to peg this bit of history on. All these structures are suffering from this. And I think a lot of this comes down to how we consume and produce media. I want to remind everyone in this room that in living memory, I mean, really old people live in memory, but in living memory, we had a president who was disabled and in a wheelchair, and no one knew it. I mean, think about that. Right now, we get to see everybody's private conversations. Our leaders are continually guarded. They're continually having to recontextualize everything they've said to, like, whispered from one person to another at a party practically. But not that long ago, we didn't know our president was disabled, which is normally a thing you'd think of as relatively obvious in this day and age. We don't really know how to deal with this. Again, we're going back to both the social norms of dealing with each other and dealing with institutions. And we are able to form these fast collectives that can act quickly and can process a lot of media about and at each other at every level of the hierarchy. And it's really good at saying no. And I think one of the reasons why it doesn't let people become respected leaders is because it never forgets. It never lets them change. It never lets them be just who they are now. And this puts the people who want to be in some sort of leadership role in contemporary life into this very, very constraining box. Did a lot with these collectives professionally for a while. Anonymous, Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street. Did a lot of interviews around the revolutions. I saw a bunch of different forms of these collectives from, and they seemed really amazing in 2011. I mean, wasn't 2011 just kind of a mind-blowing and amazing year? And we all kind of look on it with this nostalgia, but I think we may look on it with a little too much nostalgia. Like, we didn't entirely know what happened when the Indignados came in there into the streets in Spain, or when people set up those camps, because we just had structures that could say no and didn't have any way of interfacing with our traditional institutions, and things started going really, really wrong. This is what happened in Syria after the Arab Revolution, along with, it is worthwhile to note, a terrible and destabilizing drought. And now this refugee crisis, over 60 million people worldwide, more than we saw in World War II. Although I think, again, we have to go back and look at the difference between those regions of history and these when it comes to media. I think a lot of people who are on the run now around the world are on the run because their smartphone told them what was about to show up in their hometown. The death rate goes down, the refugee rate goes up, because people can run when they know what's coming. And that's one of the worlds we're living in. We're living in a world where everybody's kind of got a vague sense that we're going to have to live with climate change, and everybody's kind of adapting to that information in different ways. And that adaptation is going to, and as that proceeds, that adaptation is going to take a bunch of different forms. And back when I was doing marine science stuff a billion years ago, and we were looking at one of the effects of climate change, it was that the range of equatorial animals would move north and south from the equator, and we've seen that. I mean, we were even seeing that fairly early on with things coming up much further north than we had seen them before. I would invite you to look at the refugee maps and see which direction that's going. This is just something that was supposed to happen to organisms on Earth. We're an organism on Earth. The thing is, humans really, really like in our narratives to have one cause for things. They want to know what the real story is. The universe doesn't like one cause. It likes complex interactions of many factors that are unrelated elements and narratively unsatisfying. The universe does not care about your feelings. And whatever story you can tell, the universe will complicate it. And I think when we're talking about all these different factors together, one of the things that makes this very hard for us to deal with is that we do want one story. And I think the challenge is kind of complicating our own story when it comes to that. So these things that I said are very good at saying no, but maybe not very good at doing things. Let's ask what they are good at doing. They can occasionally disrupt corrupt authoritarians. They can occasionally, occasionally kind of slacktivism can convert along the energy chain to getting more active things. They can highlight corruption in different places. What can they do that is constructive? I mean constructive in a very literal sense. Disrupting corruption is a constructive action in a moral sense, but I mean make things. I think it's really interesting to see all these places where we've started trying to do the things that our institutions are either failing to do for us now or never did for us. And I'm not sure that it's working, but then again, most things don't work when you start doing it. So maybe it can build a playground. It probably can't build a bridge, at least right now. I'm not sure that our ad hoc bureaucracies can build reliable physical communication and infrastructure. I'm fairly sure you can't crowdfund trash collection. Though media is teaching us that power from above isn't always that good at managing trash collection or infrastructure either. And we don't know how much this has always been true, to be honest, because we didn't have the complete media vision about these failures in the past that we did now. Is there any reason in the 1980s that anyone in this room would know if they had a trash crisis? Would that have made it? I don't think so. But I think the biggest question about what these systems of, I kind of think of the systems of lateral organization can do is the thing that that our hierarchies and leadership have absolutely categorically failed to do. This is a map of planetary boundaries. This is what I far prefer to climate change or global warming because it's multidimensional and it's more accurate, and it kind of brings it down to other things that may be just as important to CO2 content but aren't as recognized as problems. It is an interesting and important question whether we, the people of Earth, can get together and deal with this before it deals with us, because it will deal with us. What do we know that it is good for? We do need to figure out this stuff soon, by the way, just heads up. That's gonna be a problem. But we do know that it's good for, this kind of lateral organization is good for building encyclopedias. You can make a lot of software with it. Some of it is infrastructural. In the physical space, we've seen a rise of more and more what was called temporary autonomous zones. They take a lot of forms that I think the people who were originally talking about them didn't expect. But I mean, this is the one that gets discussed a lot, partly because he doesn't love putting pictures of dusty white girls in bikinis on the news. But it's an interesting one because it points to something very important about a temporary autonomous zone, and by extension, an adhocracy, a lateral organizing structure. You are the curator of your own experience. You are the authority on what you do next, and you're the curator of your own experience. And if we go back to those examples of horrible things people are doing to each other on social media, this lesson from Burning Man is an important one. To a certain degree, if you keep walking into a space that you don't like and you don't walk out, you are at some point doing that to yourself. We understand that when we're at Burning Man, and we're like, well, what they're doing here is kind of not what I want to see now. But it is harder to understand on the network that we're also in this kind of autonomous zone. I like to point out the hackerspace movement. I was part of Noisebridge for a long time, still in therapy. And they demonstrate that agency quality I was talking about on the internet in a physical space. To be powerful in a hackerspace, which is such a funny phrase. But you act, and that builds your social capital, and then you might have something that's like a social position after that, all of those actions. So it's one of the places where you start to see that inversion model in the quote-unquote real world. Although I think the online-offline distinction is just ridiculous at this point. And of course, I like to talk about these two aspects of Occupy Wall Street. One of which was the political stuff that everybody knew about, but the other was that they were camps of mutual care. These organizational things kind of resurrect the idea of community and mutual care in a way that you don't have in a lot of places in society. That's one of the things that kind of happened with the 20th century, kind of rise of the powerful nation state. One of my favorite moments from all of my time in all of the parks that I camped in as part of my job was at Occupy Boston. This is from Occupy Boston. When I watched a heroin addict stumbling out of his tent, who had clearly recently used, like not clean, stumbled out of his tent, steadied himself, and went over to the kitchen tent and did dishes. Why is this so important? Because when you are low on the totem pole, and it's really hard to be lower on the totem pole in America than addict, despite the fact that we're all, how many of you mentioned your coffee? Certain kind of addict. So let's qualify that. This is, by the way, an addiction. It's just a socially acceptable one. But what was really interesting about that is that these were systems that provide people who don't have a lot of social status the ability to contribute. And contributing is how humans, who are a very social animal, gain value. And that was incredibly powerful. I think that is one of the most powerful things I got to see about that, and why that was such a compelling thing for the people who were in the camps. Because it was a place where everyone, not so much, it wasn't so much everyone had a voice, that was part of it, but they all shouted at each other, so that didn't last that long. It was that everybody could do something that was needed. So everyone had the feeling like they were needed. And right now we're living in a society where if you're looking at this, at the hierarchies, the traditional hierarchies that we're under, there's a definite feeling like the vast majority of us are probably not very needed in this world, which is really not good for the human brain. So this gets me into one of the things that I think these, this network starts to enable in really interesting ways, which is systems of mutual care. Very different from systems of top-down care, which have become prevalent. Not to say that systems of top-down care haven't been helpful. I really like the idea of centralizing epidemiology. Like, if I'm a bit of an anarchist myself, but if you want me to ask where the flaw in my own thoughts are, it's at the CDC, right? Because I want the CDC to both be tracking everything we do, not everything we do, but you get my point. And I want CDC surveillance, and I want them to be backed by men with guns. If somebody with, you know, antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis is insisting on going to a concert, like, so I understand where the educations of my own philosophies are. But systems of mutual care can do a lot that systems of top-down care can't, and they come into conflict a lot. A lot of the justification for giving all of our for living. Giving all of our power and democracy to the government is that the government can do things we can't. But it's interesting to ask where that conduit starts to turn into a barrier. And in some ways, mutual care is the most indicting thing we can do to a government. So this is from a Skype ad, but I love it because Skype like started to see where they had their piece of this, right? And this is essentially an ad about global remittance. It's about, the whole ad is about people who move away to rich countries to work their asses off and send money to poor countries. Global remittance is a really interesting piece of mutual care. It requires a huge amount of self-sacrifice to leave your family and then send them all your money. And I think when we, and by the way, I should say that global remittance is huge. Internal remittance is not counted and probably more huge. Internal remittance is when you move away inside of a country and either your parents are sending you money or you're sending them money or something like that. That's internal remittance. That is a huge economic factor that is not well and easily counted. It's counted for certain countries, but mostly I'm going to look at global remittance because it's easier to track. However, these figures are probably wrong because people engaged in global remittance are trying very hard to not pay taxes and duties on that stuff so that more of their money gets to their family. Right now, these figures are a little, I don't have the year on here, I should get that. These figures are kind of remittance to and from different countries. This blue line here, which probably doesn't show up as blue, but it's mostly not that interesting a line, is the development aid budget for the world. All the countries, all the rich countries, all the money they give to the poor countries. It has remained mostly static. It is about 200 billion now. It's not, it's higher, but it's not a lot higher. Global remittance started doing something pretty strange, which is that it was next to nothing for a long time. And now it started jumping, especially at 2000, cell phones. And it's really, really jumping up now. It's probably close to 800 billion. It's probably at this point close to 4 times as much as developmental aid. Well, what happened? The barriers, some of the barriers turned into conduits. It is easier to keep moving away and sending money back to your children when you get to see them and talk to them and remain in community with them. When you move away, but you're still part of it. Often when people do this remittance path, the first thing they will do when they will arrive is save up enough money to make sure that people at home have a cell phone or a computer or some way of talking to them. Keeping that social connection. Now the barrier has become a conduit, and that conduit is now moving a lot of money around. Software and remittance are very dry words for what can be love at a distance. And that ability to travel. We travel so much right now, and a lot of it is because of this crazy network that we're living on. Partly, it's actually brought down the cost of travel because we can do a whole bunch of things like just at the last minute on a logistical level. And partly it's because we can shuffle ourselves as well as like a smart factory can shuffle things. We kind of smart factory shuffle ourselves into different situations all the time now. And part of it is that we're never out of touch with each other. Physical space isn't as isolating as it used to be. And you can look through history and see all of these different trends. But we're living through this incredible change in, we're living through this incredible kind of like moment, inflection point, I think, where it isn't that any of this stuff is new. It's that at some point, it just becomes a different thing. I mean, technically your calculator is a Turing machine, so it can run World of Warcraft, but it's not really fun to play it that way. Mm-hmm. Right now, with 7.5 billion people on the planet, every minute that passes is about 13,000 years of human experience, which is roughly how long we've been recognizably us. It's kind of humbling to think about how many moments of human experience pass every moment when you're talking about billions. It's also impossible to keep it in your head as an individual. But that's actually the thing we have to learn to do right now. I love this picture. This is my first map and my current map. And to say, or my first apple and current apple, that's pre-map. Oh, to say these are similar machines is absolutely technically true. To say they're doing the same thing is clearly not true. So all of this is happening in a time when we absolutely have no idea how to live in the world yet. And that's understandable. Normally with big social changes, you get generations. We're getting like a couple dozen years, have fun, right? We don't entirely know what this network and our lives are capable of yet. And the other thing to note is that computers suck. We're living through great change and great suck. That's my daughter. She's now 13. So, and computer security sucks. This is the VTech breach, which is one of my favorites. Leaked the data of over 6 million children, including video chats. Fortunately, VTech had made sure in their terms of service that they weren't liable for it. None of our institutions are keeping up with our world, including just our way of relating to each other. They can make us weird and cruel and inappropriate and creative. This is from the 90s, and it is still the best quote ever about the internet, and I think it's the one that we should think of as we're going forward. This is the only slide I love to read. Type in, find people who have sex with goats that are on fire, and the computer will say specify type of goat. Normally I read it slightly better than that, but I mean, like, no matter, as Richard Jennings said, no matter what kind of freak you are, like, there's 1,000 friends, best friends you have out there, and that can be really distorting. You can think that your little group of the world that no one's ever heard of is about to take over because you've managed to put yourself into a place where you think everyone thinks like you. So the great Marxist revolution is going to happen any day now, because all you do is talk to great Marxist revolutionaries on the internet, and there's more of them than you could ever talk to. It is not in your awareness that it is 0.0001% of the world, because it is 100% of your world. So being able to kind of like perceive outside of that is a skill that we have not learned or taught each other yet. It's really amazing in some ways. Like, we can really find communities that could not have existed prior to these moments. This is a My Little Pony convention. And by the way, the My Little Pony fandom, the Bronies, was born on 4chan. These are literally the nicest people on the internet. And they were the only people besides child pornographers that were banned off of the random board at 4chan for being too contentious. And it lets us kind of, like, when we're in that tiny little homophily, it lets us kind of believe that our issues are much more important than they may be. It lets us kind of engage in these fictions and really like come together to be crappy in ways where we're just not getting enough feedback. So this is my this is my moment. This is my kind of unicorn chaser for this one for the internet. But it also lets us spread disinformation at amazing speeds. And this is absolutely my favorite. It's a warning about ISIS soldiers fleeing Syria and getting ready for war. Just in case you're not familiar with it, this is the original meme. That is Ice Cube. You might have noticed that I like Ice Cube. But passed around completely unironically in certain white supremacist communities, because we're not, like, you didn't used to in the world have to go, when I get up in the morning, I should try and falsify my own beliefs. Like that's not something we learn to do in school, but it's something we kind of have to learn to do on the internet. But I think the internet's favorite fallacy is no true Scotsman. It's the place where I think we get hung up the most. And it's the one that allows us to form things like Gamergate. Now, if you're not familiar with No True Scotsman, which is also the best name fallacy, it's this. The story in it is like a man reads in the newspaper, Scotsman reads in the newspaper about somebody murdering someone else. And he says, well, no Scotsman would vilely murder someone like that. Next week he reads in the newspaper about a Scotsman vilely murdering someone. He says, well, no true Scotsman would do that. So it's this is such a really, really, really easy fallacy to fall into on the internet of just going, I have defined this category and I can find people to agree with me. And you can live your whole life in those true Scotsmen. My favorite is like, this is also Anonymous's favorite fallacy. Like anytime anyone Anonymous does anything, there's somebody else there to say, no true Anon would do that. And Anonymous was this really interesting case of how people organize laterally to do things online. And that met with a lot of not just success and failure, but like a spectrum of things that you can count as success and failure. It's still acting out in the world, and acting out sometimes like it was in 3rd grade in the world. Yeah, targeting, this is Anonymous deciding it's going to start targeting ISIS. But interestingly, ISIS is pretty much a lot like Anonymous. Like the structure and the way that it definitely learned its lessons from Anonymous and 4chan, at least as much as from the Quran. And honestly, I've read the Quran and I'm pretty sure they didn't get a lot much from it. And if anything is the B-tard version of Islam, it is ISIS. And they are very much a media creature. They're very much like a thing that formed that lives both in the world and on the network simultaneously, convincing itself of things. And like Gamergate, these other media creatures, they tap into something else that's often overlooked in the modern age, which is this basic human need to be part of something larger than yourself, to derive your meaning from your tribe and from your projects. In the 20th century, nationalism, which gave us this very top-down perspective that we're kind of like dealing with conflict over right now, took the place of tribalism in this very human urge. And with nationalism, they gave us a future and great projects like killing all the Jews or going to the moon, right? But the internet is able to take on some of these projects as well in certain ways. And some of them make amazing access to human knowledge, and some of them make really weird parties. But it's all haphazard. It's all happening in niche ways. And lots of niches on a planet of 7 billion people. And we still need to figure out how to build bridges and how to keep physical infrastructure going and how to pick up trash. But right now we're just living in the age of drama. And that's what we're going to have in the 21st century. We're going to have this crazy for a while until we develop that thing I said we don't have at the beginning, which is the social norms for the city that we live in. It's everything changing, and it's changing us, but human minds still work the same. We still don't realize we're changing. We don't realize that we used to be different. We don't realize the whole world used to be different. And we're living in a era where change in degree is becoming a change of kind, and all the spectators are becoming participants. So I think one of the things we need to accept about this era, and I'm starting to talk about this more, and it's something nobody wants to learn, or nobody wants to hear, is that you can't do this right without digital literacy. Because we keep asking, how do we have all these policy decisions about privacy or other things when people don't know how this stuff works? And the answer is you don't. Eventually, everyone has to learn how this works. We decided when we started having these democracy things that everybody had to learn how to read if they were going to be voting at some point. And that was one of the evidences for universal education. Well, right now we have an education system that spends 12 years teaching us all how to read and about 45 minutes teaching us what networks are. So we're gonna have to do some jiggery-pokery there. So the question isn't how do we do all of this within a illiterate population, it's how do we start getting a literate population? We're not gonna go back to the eras of scribes, and we can't stay in the eras of sysadmins. But one other piece of context collapse that I want to talk about with Our Invisible City. We talk a bit about like the loss of body language and direct communication, but I think one of the things that's been really, really brutal is the loss of architecture. When we're in these collectives, when we're talking on the internet, we don't have the cues from the room that we're in. We don't have the cues of other people's body language or their clothes or anything like that, but we also don't have the world in the same way. So when you're talking to people on Twitter, it is very funny to me that we don't know if we're in a dive bar or a state dinner. Like, I have seen people who definitely think that they're in a dive bar talking to people who definitely think they're in a state dinner. And that conversation goes just as badly as you would imagine. The space between us that was a boundary has become a conduit. And we don't know how to handle that yet. We kind of understand the physical world intuitively, that we are alone in the universe, that we live in this little bubble that is our perceptions, our thoughts. But for the first time in our species history, our interior life is social. And for many of us, our interior life is more social than our physical life. That takes coping. It takes coping skills. And it takes learning to put in boundaries in your interior life to live in your social life, which we don't have right now. It's hard to remember that we still live in a bubble of our own perceptions and our own thoughts when we're having this social interior life, but it's still always behind walls of language and metaphor. We're not really there, in the same way that we're in a way not really here. We're all isolated. We're all trapped in a universe of our own bodies. I like to say that everyone's a well of infinite solitude, doomed to never be truly known, because I'm upbeat. Perhaps even by ourselves through time, and the internet hasn't changed that. We just imagine that it's changed that. But we're still pieces of mud with pretensions of God. So I think the first step is to having an effective online life and culture is kindness. It's kind of weird to walk around to all these technical things and say, everybody should just start being a little bit more nice. But it's really important that we do learn, for instance, if somebody sounds like an angry 13-year-old boy on the internet, do remember that there's a chance it's an angry 13-year-old boy. If an angry 13-year-old boy was saying something to you in a physical social context, you would treat them like an angry child, not treat them like someone to destroy with all your effort. You don't know. Like, one of the things about having that social interior life is that without these physical cues, without this architecture or something, we kind of imagine everyone else as some version of us that is misbehaving. And you see this a lot on the internet. People kind of talk to somebody and they just at some level assume the other person's had the same day they've had. If I'm in a shitty mood, everybody else has to be in a shitty mood. If I'm upbeat, why are you sad? But we're constantly coming from not just totally different cultural assumptions, totally different days, totally different moments, things that we would understand intuitively if we saw each other physically. But right now we need to build a model for everyone else is not us. They might be coming from their mother's death or a car accident or a birthday party. And they aren't bringing any of the clues into the social realm. So we really, really need to start getting a lot nicer online. And I think it's not just a matter of like, I actually believe this extends to a lot of things people are thinking like mean online activism has been great because it's calling all these things out. But in a way, calling these things out has also resulted in much of polarization, which we may be living through right now. And a little kindness goes a long way in these situations, in every direction we can manage. I have a lot of hope, but I do believe that in addition to being kinder online and having more lateral organization, we also kind of need to own this cyborgian social existence on this planet as well. Like, nature is over, by the way. Like, it's done. We're just going to have to terraform this planet. But what an easy starter planet for terraforming. I mean, that's great news. This is the latest thing on this amazing human journey. And we're going to have to start thinking of ourselves differently en masse. Because like, we've always like used lone animal and pack animal metaphors for human beings. Like, we're wolves, we're tigers, we're cats. But we're actually a hypersocial species. We're one of those crazy social species. I know of 3 species off the top of my head who have brute force solved the traveling salesman problem. And it's not a perfect solution, but it's a brute force solved solution. It wasn't chimps, dolphins, or lions, or tigers, or wolves. It was ants, slime molds, and the species that actually has traveling salesmen. And when we're at our best, we kind of look like a slime mold. And that's how I kind of want us to think of each other, as other members of a slime mold colony. Always locked in that communication network. And yes, next time you're on a plane and you look down, notice our slime mold existence. Thank you very much. I'm happy to go into discussion now.
One quick aside is that we are live broadcasting, so if you have a desire to ask a question or answer a question, let me off the air, let me know so I can mute it. But that's how we'll do that.
Okay. I'm gonna do that so that everybody doesn't look at my laptop. Questions? Or do we also want to look at the internet stuff as well? I don't know. You're arranging that. Yes.
So, you made this offhand remark that, at some point we're going to have to all adapt to Florida warning with a picture of Florida on the screen. And
I don't have a picture of Florida.
Well,
okay, but go on. Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, maybe I sort of glitched on
No problem.
on the morning, but Florida comes. What brings Florida to mind is it's a place where people are spectacularly failing to adapt, as in still buying expensive real estate in Miami. There does seem, so networks don't seem to be curing our short-sightedness.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, in some ways, I think a lot of this talk is about how they're enhancing our short-sightedness. I think I'm trying to describe a problem area that we need to solve, and maybe a few of the tools that we need to use to solve it. But it's also a matter that networks are making some of these problems much worse. Like, we don't know how to behave, we don't know how to cooperate, we kind of like form massive groups and kill another part of the thing without really any. The nice part about top-down systems and justice is that there's at least a process, as opposed to, we got a lot of pitchfork mobs out there now. I think that where the network becomes more help than hurt is when we learn how to exist in it and how to use it wisely. I think a lot of this is about saying, hey, everyone, we've got this thing. It probably could help save us, but we're going to have to learn how to use it and use it well. And these are some of the challenges to using it. Yeah, humans are incredibly short-sighted a lot of the time. That's not changed in many thousands of years and probably not going to change. But the hope that I have is that we can build institutions with long vision. One of the things that I've been doing for the past few years on and off is I like to ask people, what should the world look like in 100 years? Occasionally, this question has made people cry. Like, sometimes they start telling me what they think it'll look like, and I have to stop them and say, no. Not what you wish that your family had in 100 years, not what the dystopia you're afraid of in 100 years, but what should be true? Because without that, you're probably not going to entirely get there, but you're definitely not going to get there if you don't have an endpoint in mind. So I think one of the reasons why people want to buy beachfront property on something that is basically a glorified sandbar in a time of global sea rise is because they're not asking what should the world look like, or even what will the world look like. They're not thinking through long time. And I think our networks actually let us do that in a way that we couldn't do it before. Because when you can look back in time, you can look forward in time much more easily. I often say, if you want to see the future, studying history lets you cheat on the future, right? And so we can use it that way. We can also use it to destroy ourselves. I'm talking about these things because I really want us to use it the good way. Yeah.
So thank you so much. This is a really interesting talk. And I thought actually, so I'm a librarian, and one of the things that people say about OCLC is they call it our company loves cash, which is like kind of terrible. But and maybe it might be worth incorporating into this talk. And I really liked the beginning section where you're talking kind of about the unintended consequences of services and how even with the best of intentions, things can kind of spiral in ways that aren't expected because of market forces, because of capitalism.
I would actually say just because of humans.
Because of humans.
I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with the employees of OCLC wanting to have houses and send their children to schools. I doubt OCLC has like outrageous Goldman Sachs-ish payment and bonuses. I think we have to understand, if we're going to get anywhere, we do have to understand that most of these needs that start looking terrible in aggregate are completely reasonable on the individual level.
So I guess the question that I have is, so a lot of what you were talking about is kind of how the internet is bad at storytelling, and how it has changed storytelling. And I'm kind of wondering like how, in this in a network world, like how you see, or whether you see like storytelling as a force for social change, and whether or not you think that like it's become easier to create loose networks, but harder to create kind of meaningful networks, or whether meaningful, I don't know, I'm not explaining this well, but basically my question is like, how do you see network societies relating to storytelling and history, and like how do you think that history will look back on this time of slacktivism?
I think one of the interesting things is that going back to that kind of conception of the network as this medium that captures but doesn't forget, and so on and so forth, and doesn't have a real memory, as it were, is that we're kind of, this is going to sound kind of crazy, but go with me here, we're living through the oral history period of the network. We're not literate, we're not kind of like writing down, we're pre-Homer on the internet. And in one way, it's like I got really into the idea of blockchains, the Bitcoin stuff, but my interest in blockchains was literary. Like my interest in Bitcoin was largely literary, because for my money, having done a bunch of technical stuff on the internet, having been a sysadmin and so on and so forth, blockchains were the first time the network had memory, had a written memory, something that wasn't an oral tradition. And like writing itself, the first thing it was used to do was count sheep. But the idea of how we construct, we can't really do a lot of good storytelling without either oral traditions, which we're too early to have, or written language, which we essentially, in a way, don't have a network version of that. So we don't have that social memory that we use for storytelling in traditional literature and things like that. I think we'll probably get there, but it's going to require a really big education piece to get there. I mean, in a way, I feel like I'm trying to like stand in Homer's Greece and like prognosticate about the 20th century, right? Like it's a really, really tough question. The nice part is it's all happening so fast that I can kind of compress it up in a way that, the Greek philosophers didn't get a chance to. But storytelling is a key part of, storytelling is how we make our slime molds, right? Like it's a key part of identity formation in our species. It is absolutely one of the most important pieces right now. But we don't have the tools to do it in our digital life the way that we were doing it from 50 years ago back to Homer. Does that answer? I'm not sure. Okay. Yeah.
Well, I really like your question about storytelling, because I think it really ties into this idea of context collapse. And I think that pushing back on this idea of context collapse, I don't think that there has been a context collapse. It's just that there are a multitude of contexts, and that part of, you talk about digital literacy, maybe we call it network literacy.
I
Okay.
use that term as well. I should define context collapse because I think we're agreeing.
Yeah.
I should take a little bit more, another moment on that. Context collapse is when you have multiple contexts, but an interaction or an event or a cultural thing can pass between them on its own. And that's the collapse. Like I do one thing that means one thing in one context, but it means something in another. And it exists without my intention in both contexts. I pull this from Dana Boyd, and she actually pulls it from a previous example, which I really, really love. Stokely Carmichael in the civil rights era had one way of talking to white audiences and one way of talking to black audiences. And then, and he was very popular. And then the TV people came and said, we're going to put you on TV. And he had to decide what audience to talk to. And he decided to talk to his black audience. And all the white people were going, but we thought he was such a nice boy. The change in his manner kind of blew something out of the water, and they started seeing him differently. And that was a very specific, and media causes context collapse.
Absolutely. And part of this idea of network literacy or digital literacy, and you talk about kindness as well. I mean, I see how that wraps up into being able to read the room and understand how to deliver these messages. So part of the challenge that we have going forward is how do we equip ourselves with the ability to read a room or read a situation and be able to participate in a particular way, because you give this good example that we don't have the physical cues that we're used to. And there's a lot of research that's trying to look at how do we reintegrate social information into digital settings, right? And it's just an ongoing battle of how to make that work. But it seems like that's part of the challenge that we're facing right now.
But we're still at that point, I think, part of this network literacy and media literacy. I kind of like media and network and digital literacy are kind of wound up in my head about like literacy of how to live now. Isn't just how do I say something so that my context travels with me or something like that. It's also, I think, probably the more important piece that we're not talking about is how do I walk away from something I don't understand? How do I decide this message isn't for me? How do I not comment when it's not really about my thing? How do we teach people not to do YouTube comments because they're not helpful to them as well as anyone else? And there's some good YouTube, hashtag not all YouTube comments, but how do we figure out that we've walked into a dive bar and say, I don't want to be in a dive bar right now. We don't have in our conversations the clearly marked exit signs that dive bars are required to have. But we also aren't looking for them. So I think there's another piece there where we as a producing and consuming, need to learn how to consume with discretion and not just produce with discretion, which when we were looking at top-down media, all of it was about producing with discretion. Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I think I found your discussion of the dive bar versus the steak dinner super useful for contextualizing what you were saying about social norms earlier, because I think you sort of framed it as, well, we don't really have social norms on the internet. And it's like, to me, it seems like we do, but people disagree about what social norms are active in any particular space, right? And that's untrue in the real world spaces, right? There's like the example that pops to mind is that there's a vast disagreement about what the social norm is around talking to people on the street or catcalling
or talking in a movie theater.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Or texting in a movie theater, right? And there's pushback from all directions about no, we own this social norm and we're going to tell you this versus we own this social norm and we're going to tell you that. But it seems to me that the sort of discussion about architecture and context collapse is what makes it, even in sites where the norms would not be complicated in real life spaces, those sites are even more complicated on the internet. So it doesn't seem, so I think for me, I sort of had this reaction where I was like, well, there are social norms. Wait, what are we talking about? And it's actually that everyone just doesn't agree about which set of norms are necessarily
the way I put it to kind of define it a little bit better, and thank you for pushing me to define it a little bit better, is we have social norms and we put them on the internet, but they're not network aware social norms, I think is probably the best way of doing it. They're not network literate social norms.
It's easier for us to walk into rooms on the internet than it is for us to walk into rooms where we don't belong. Because space.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the challenge.
And it's easier, and people love upsetting themselves. Wow, do people love upsetting themselves? Like, I do think right now, like, the massive network addiction is getting upset. And at some point, I think one of the nice things about getting into middle age is that I'm just tired of being upset. So I'm just kind of waiting for the network to get out of its self-upsetting adolescence. Because like the culture is kind of very adolescent that way. It just wants to be outraged.
Isn't yours outrage like boring now? Like I see, like people are just so outraged all the time.
Dude, you're such a hipster.
Just like bored with outrage. It's like, oh, okay, I've seen that before.
Which, you know, a lot of people's response to bored to outrage is to get more outrage so it's less boring. It's like you have to use more of the drug to get the same hit. Yeah.
So you talk a lot about we're in a period of change and then we figure it out, right? Is this pattern? There's also a lot of ongoing rhetoric and technology about how we're going to continue increasing the speed of things. And I am by no means a singularitarian, but I also agree with Rushkoff about how we're already in a sort of like present shock, right? We're already always trying to figure it out and we're not quite sure what's going on. Do you see a point where we'll kind of ease up on the rate of change and be able to pause, or is that going to be self-imposed rather than enforced by the tech?
I think the tech, we've already hit the slow. I mean, I think what happened is the tech isn't that different than it was 20 years ago. Like if you look at kind of the underlying stuff, pretty much like as soon as we had cookies, we could do all the things with the web we do now. And that was 21 years ago. So we invented email and web browsers and cookies and cookies, and almost everything's kind of a variation on that. So I actually think we're kind of in the social adaptation to a bunch of tech we built, period. There's a few things that are new, like we're now doing things over radio frequency to our pockets, which frankly we could have been doing 50 years ago if it wasn't for some decisions made by the FCC and other bodies like that. That's a rant for a different talk. Yeah, we've got, but a lot of it is kind of permutation from the same thing. I mean, I did a column for the Atlantic years ago now, where I was talking about, it was a big technology column, and I was talking about like the biotech stuff, and I was relating a company that was bringing a drug to market for a truly small fraction of what it normally costs based on how they were using their own social networks and file sharing and contracting and email and so on and so forth. And there was a point where my editor was like, you know, the only tech in this really is like email and file sharing. And I was like, and now you know what email and file sharing can do. And to what I think of his great credit, he's like, yeah, all right. Like, we haven't learned how to use the stuff we invented in the 90s. We've learned how to like hit ourselves and each other over the head with them. But like, you know, we learned how to modify rocks in the stone era, but we built cathedrals much later out of largely similar techniques. So I don't think the underlying, like nobody's doing, I would love it if somebody did something about how routing is completely freaking broken on the internet. You know, and this is having a technical background sometimes, watching all these edifices being built on on the infrastructure I grew to know and love in the 90s is just like, oh man, you know, there's so much about this stack that we could change and make better. And nobody's really doing that. Like there's really sensible changes we could make to how we manage RF and how we manage the stack and how we manage the global network. But we're just gonna run with what we've got. So, and all the weird things that come with it. So I think most of the new and scary is cultural change on top of not old infrastructure, but not brand new infrastructure. So we're kind of, one form of slowdown doesn't necessarily, in some ways I think that form of slowdown speeds up the other thing. Because it means that we kind of like take the other stuff and try more permutations of it, as opposed to trying the one thing that is obvious to do with a new piece of technology. Cool, thanks. Yeah.
So one of the parts that I found really interesting was when you talked about this kind of world without leaders and the kind of flipping between like publishing and deciding versus deciding and publishing. And so one of the things that I think I've seen in my own experience is working with people that are maybe starting out in the open source community. And so what I often see that they struggle with is that you have this situation where they're very used to, they're like, what do I do? And
Yes.
Open source is completely the opposite. Like, pick something out, try it, see if it works, and they're always looking for direction. And so what kinds of, it seems like we have to train everyone to be leaders in a place where nobody's leaders.
Yes.
And so I'm just
I mean,
curious,
this
how
is
do
one of those
we-
things that's really, really interesting, is that we have been taught all of our lives to go to class when we were told to.
Yeah.
You know, I like to say we go to schools designed in a 19th century factory model to learn how to be 20th century office workers in a century where neither of those things really exist anymore. With the aspiration to be, we trained in 19th century models with the aspiration of being 20th century office workers, you know, and none of this exists anymore. Yeah, we're not training people how to behave in an autonomous zone or network collective. So people naturally walk in and do the same thing that they did when they walked into a classroom, was to say, what is my assignment? How do I work my way up in this? And everybody says, your assignment is do a thing. Why are you even talking to me? And a lot of this is like, I have now spent more time having, you know, decided that the glamour of freelance journalism wasn't enough for me. I've started talking more and more to educators.
Yeah.
You know, started focusing on middle school, where the real, you know, rock star accolades are, which is like, we need to be teaching our kids how to not behave like they're in a school. We need to be teaching them how to behave like they're in an autonomous zone, and figuring out how to work together and this sort of thing. Like, that actually needs to be an education piece, because otherwise you're stuck learning it. I mean, you know, we're doing the network equivalent right now of walking from an abstinence only education into a sex party.
Yeah.
Like, we have
That's
none of
true.
the right tools for this. And I do think, like, that piece, I don't want to give up on all of you grown-ups, but I might. But I do think, like, the thing here is we need to go back into the education system and start revamping that to be a little bit more hippy-dippy, self-motivated, because people are getting out from the structured thing into the world and they panic. They have no tools for dealing with the unstructured world, because there's no factory jobs. The only thing you work to bells in the world is a factory job that is now just robots in much of the world.
One of the strengths that ended up happening during Sandy response is I deployed with a team that was both pretty military heavy, and also I was a bridge to Occupy Sandy, and the military people were like, what do we do? How about we all meet here? We're going to talk about these, and like, I am creating structure for them because I know how to create it for myself and others. And they were great at showing up and doing those things.
Right.
And then I was like, okay, so you're going to plan tomorrow.
And there's a place for like deciding, I'm going to join this team and do something in this person's structure. But you have to decide that at this point. Like, if nobody's there to tell you to obey someone, you have to tell yourself to do that. And that is nowhere in our education system. And we need to fix that. Stat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I have to go soon, just so you know. I'm going to turn this off, but
Okay.
y'all can keep
Can
going.
we see if anyone wanted to say anything from the internet?
I'll look again
Okay.
while you do that.
oh yeah, so I think this brings up an interesting tension though. You talk about